Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 16. The twitching of his ears woke him. Adam fought against it. The events of Christmas Day, though good, having exhausted him mind and body. Yet when he heard the quiet footsteps echo off the floors, he sat up in a panic. "Who's there?" he gasped, eyes searching the darkness. He heard them again, further away this time, somewhere beyond his chambers, possibly beyond the West Wing itself. Already on his feet, Adam forgot such things as robes or candles as he bounded to the doors. He pulled one open and stepped into the darkness, falling still again as he listened. The footsteps were clear now, and he followed them out of the upper floors of the West Wing. Near the top of the stairs sat a lit candelabra, the only light in the halls besides the dim glow of the fire he had left behind. "Oh, Lumiere!" He exhaled in relief, slowly slowing his pace. "It's only you." The candlestick remained motionless, and Adam blinked twice before reaching over to pick the man up. But no, this wasn't Lumiere at all, but a solid, motionless household object. Adam shook his head at himself. With a place so large, there were certainly duplicates of many objects. Of course there were other candles of the same shape lying around. Strange how he had never seen them. Down the winding steps, beneath the grand buttresses, Adam stalked the sound with bated breath, while ignoring the stares of the old sculpted demons in the walls. He supposed they had been truly rendered angels and saints long ago, but the dust and wear of time had left the faces strange, and their poses menacing. At least, he had always thought so. The footfalls led into the castle's roots, down the old wooden steps he had run up and down often as a child. These days they always creaked beneath his feet, but were oddly quiet tonight as he descended into the kitchens. He looked out across the dark room. Barrels and boxes littered the floors, a faint light falling over the silent space from the moon that peeked its way through the small window over the sink. Adam could see bits of snow floating behind the glass. Something about it felt like déjà vu, he wondered. He'd nearly forgotten why he had come when a sudden creak rang out from the shadows. Startled, Adam dropped the candelabra and turned, shocked to see the door held open by a woman in white. But this wasn't just déjà vu. This was a memory. But how? Whatever it was, he didn't care, flying down the steps and pushing aside the barrels with quick swipes of his paws. Yet for all his efforts, he seemed unable to reach her. "Mama!" he cried desperately, paws tearing carelessly through a large crate. "Stop! Don't leave me! Not again!" To his relief, she obeyed, freezing in place, even as she continued to stare out into the storm. Adam tore through the last crate, rushing up to her side. "Mama!" he gasped, a trembling paw reaching out to her. As he found her hand, she turned back and looked up at him with sad eyes. "You're too late, darling," she said softly. "Too late to stop me." "But Mama, you're right here," he said desperately. She turned, looking into the kitchens. "Too late to break the spell," she went on. "Too late to save them." Adam's eyes grew wide, staring back at the candle he had dropped on the floor. Eyes catching the quiet dishes in the cupboard. A porcelain teapot and a small matching cup sat still as stone atop the stove. "No!" he breathed in horror. "No, they can't be gone! I still have time!" He stopped as he turned. A new face before him, one younger and even more familiar now. Belle looked up at him, eyes filled with tears. "Too late to love me." "No, no!" he choked out. Her hand slipped from his, and she stepped into the storm. "Belle, wait!" he cried, rushing after her. The trees surrounded him at once, a solid force blocking his way. "No!" he gasped. "No, let me through!" he shouted, slamming his fists against the invisible wall. "Belle!" She paused, looking back, her shape a dark outline in the moonlight. Another figure emerged beside her. Red eyes bright in the darkness, grasping Belle's arm and pulling her away. They were quickly consumed by the black forest beyond. Belle! Adam sat up, gasping for breath. He blinked rapidly, his own yells echoing off the walls as the dim room around him slowly came into focus. His room. A dream, he realised, swallowing roughly and running a paw through his mane. Just a dream. Yet the words from the nightmare lingered in his thoughts. Too late. He spun towards the corner table, the pinkish glow still shining through the cover. He didn't care enough to count the petals now, for a fresh fear washed over him that brought him to his feet, and back out to the very hall he had just run through in his dreams. No lit candelabra awaited him, nor did footsteps echo off the quiet walls. Only the heavy pounding of his own feet as he sprinted the short distance towards her room. He slowed as he neared the door, standing still and listening closely for her soft breathing from the other side. Yet he heard nothing. Heart flying into his throat, he pressed an ear against the thick wood, listening for any sign that Belle was safe inside. But again he heard nothing. Belle! He called out nervously, panic filling his chest. Belle, are you in there? I'm coming in! Adam? He turned around, seeing Belle walking up to him from the end of the hall, a small candle in one hand and the other clutching a shawl around his shoulders. Where were you? He cried, rushing over and resting anxious hands on her shoulders. Are you all right? Did you see anyone? No, nothing like that. I was only, She looked a bit embarrassed, stopping. I was simply using le toilette, she admitted. Oh, he said, calming a bit, but still chewing his lip nervously. Adam? She started, cocking her head. Are you all right? He frowned, looking back into the darkness. You're pathetic. The enchantress's words came to his mind, taunting him. He shook his head. I'm fine, he said, pulling his hands back. Just thought I heard something. Belle didn't look convinced, but let him lead her back to her room regardless. She stepped inside, paused, and turned back. Are you sure you're all right? She prodded. He hummed, nodding quickly. Good night. Night, she said reluctantly. As her door clicked shut, he huffed, plodding slowly back to his chambers. He paused before the hearth, realising he had lost his desire to sleep, then moved across the room and pushed open the balcony doors. A fierce wind met him, and he quickly pulled the door shut and walked across the patio to lean against the stone railing. The wind blew his fur into his eyes, but he ignored it, glaring into the woods below. That witch! She could be anyone. Anywhere! And suddenly Adam came to a decision. Belle couldn't return to Molyneux tomorrow. You can't go back. It's too dangerous. Belle continued securing Olive's bridle, tossing the reins over her head. Adam, I have to. My house is no doubt covered in dust. I need to settle things with Genevieve, and our bookseller is certainly starting to worry about me. He was one of the few people who ever even showed me any real kindness. I have to let him know I'm safe. We can write to them. Have Henry post the letters in Beaumont. I still need to pay Genevieve for her help. I doubt the coin would make it safely through the mail. Take Henry with you then, Adam insisted. Or better yet, have him relay the messages in your place. If the witch is really after me, I'd rather not drag Henry into this. He's only just found Chip. I can't risk it. You shouldn't be risking yourself, Adam cried in exasperation. He couldn't believe she was just so stubborn about this. Just a house! Belle, I'll buy you a new one, damn it! She stopped what she was doing, her eyes growing wide and looking back at him sharply. He grimaced, regretting his outburst but refusing to look away. What are you going to do, Adam? Belle asked coolly. Force me to stay here? He growled, turning aside and kicking at the dirt in frustration. No, he grumbled quietly. Though I should. Belle huffed at that. turning her back to him and tightening the rest of the saddle in silence. Frustrated and irritable, Adam crossed his arms and leaned against the side of the stall, glaring into a pile of hay. Several long, uncomfortable moments passed before he looked up again. Belle had finished her task, standing stone still at Olive's side. Her lips pursed nervously. The air felt thick and awkward. He didn't like it at all. He frowned deeply. Maybe he could let her go back, but not without making things right. Swallowing his pride, Adam stepped over carefully, reaching for her hand, now resting on the saddle horn as she faced away from him. When she didn't pull away, he held it tighter.
"I'm sorry,"
he said quietly. Belle sighed. "I'm sorry too. I understand why this is hard for you. I do." She glanced over at his chest. "But Papa gave me one responsibility. To care for our home. And I've already neglected it," she said, looking ashamed. "He built that home with his own hands, Adam. I know it might be hard for you to understand, but it's one of the few things left in this world that he can be proud of."
"He can be proud of you,"
he said honestly.
"And I think he'd rather see you in one piece than your house."
Belle's eyes softened as she finally looked up at him. "Adam, I like how you look out for me. For all of us," she said. "But I can't just stop living because I'm afraid something's going to happen." Adam ducked his head. When she put it that way, well, maybe she was right.
"It's not that I want to trap you here," he said, staring at his feet. "It's just, I hate that I'm trapped here. That I can't go with you. That if something happened..."
She pulled her hand away then, arms around him in a moment later. He returned the embrace in an instant, savouring their closeness as it chased away the tension. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow morning," Belle said, looking up at him. "I promise." He nodded in some reluctance, letting her go and guiding Olive to the front gates. Sir Giles met them there, and Belle called out to Max as she pulled herself into the saddle. Adam watched, heart full of nervous energy, as those 3 words he had been aching to say each day flooded his thoughts. He sucked in a breath.
"Belle, wait!"
he gasped more loudly than he had meant to, reaching out to her unconsciously. She paused, reins in hand, as she glanced at him.
I...
He sucked in a breath, then sighed, curling his fingers back into feet.
"I was wondering..."
he amended lamely. "Yes?" He chewed his lip, trying to come up with something else to say. His eyes brightened a moment later, an idea forming in his mind.
"Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night?"
She smiled. "Of course. But, Adam, we have dinner together every night." She chuckled.
I meant a more than one spoon kind of dinner," he explained.
Belle's smile widened, most certainly recalling their first meal together. She nodded earnestly. Adam watched her take off in a gallop, Max sprinting at Olive's heels, still worried, but at least comforted that she had taken his fastest horse. And now he had something to keep him busy while she was gone.
"Lumiere, I'm ready to take you up on your offer."
The candelabra cocked his head before a waxy grin spread over his features. "Ah, mon prince! Quintessent passionate!" she cried. "Just what you need to make up after your row, no?" Adam blinked, then felt his cheeks burn.
What do you mean by that?"
"You quarrelled, my lord, did you not?" the man said seriously. "Had old Cogsworth quite worried there for a minute."
But how did you..."
"Dear, when you have a house full of servants, there are eyes and ears everywhere." Mrs. Potts chuckled, suddenly beside them. "But if you ask me, it was about time you two butted head over something. I was starting to grow concerned."
"Concerned that we weren't arguing?"
Adam asked in confusion. "Any 2 intelligent people are going to have their differences, love," she explained. "Of course, you shouldn't fight over every petty thing. But when a couple never disagrees, it is usually a sign of an unhealthy dominion by one party. An argument every now and then is nothing unusual, and even among the closest lovers. Your own parents did on occasion, and always came closer out of it.
Well, I'd rather avoid it in the future, all the same,
Adam admitted, still abashed. I must discuss le menu with Chef Bouche. Lumiere went on. Then gather my footmen, and have the ballroom sparkling for your dance.
Wait, dance?
Adam said dumbly. Of course! Women love dancing. And what is the perfect evening without holding your ton amour in your arms, beneath the sparkle of a shimmering chandelier? Ah, que c'est beau, he said, resting an arm over his golden chest. Someone giggled behind him. Oh, Lumiere, you are such a romantic. Fifi skirted along beside him. You would know best, mon chéri, the man said deeply, wrapping her in his golden arms and dipping her low to the ground. Adam wasn't paying attention, suddenly recalling his conversation with Belle a couple of nights before, as the servants twirled joyfully across the hall. I've only been to one dance. It was just, you know who sort of took most of the fun out of it for me. Belle had missed out on the dances growing up, and Adam was suddenly determined to make up for it. Lumiere was right. She would love a dance. He found himself smiling, wishing it was tomorrow night already, thinking back to the steps of the waltzes he had learnt as a child. This would certainly be a lot more enjoyable than dancing with the spoiled daughters of a dozen rich visiting dukes.
Wait a minute, he said abruptly. How am I going to do this? The last time I danced I was this tall,
he exclaimed, holding a paw up to his hip.
He looked down at his wolf-like feet, frowning. Not to mention I had heels.
Lumiere hummed seriously, crossing his golden arms. Perhaps some practice is in order.
All right, how's that?
Sophie lifted her foot from where she sat, rotating her metal ankle once, then twice. It didn't stick at all. Oh, that's so much better! A quiet smile flitted over Henry's face, as he let a couple more drops of oil from the canteen drop onto the rag in his hand. He lifted her opposite boot onto his knee, where he sat cross-legged on the workshop's floor, starting to oil down the second set of hinges with care. A moment later, Sophie let out a laugh. He raised his brows. What? He asked. Sorry, it just tickles a bit, she admitted.
Henry's eyes grew wide, the part of his cheeks that were visible now a deep red as he hastily set her foot down. I'm sorry. I didn't realise that you could, feel that. Sophie had to bite back a laugh. The poor man.
The lady's ankles were quite intimate after all. Here, she offered. I can get to my knees on my own. He nodded nervously, handing her the cloth before standing and sitting beside her, on the bench. He clasped his hands together, staring into his lap. You know, Henry, I never got to thank you for your gift, she said a moment later.
Oh, well, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Sorry if it was a little odd. I just sort of assumed you were a soldier from the south or something.
He grinned sheepishly. Sophie giggled a bit. No, I like it. It was sweet, she said, glancing down at the knife secured into its case along her belt. And with that enchantress lurking around, I'll feel a lot better having a weapon on me.
He only looked troubled at that, brows wrinkling in concern. I still keep thinking I'm in a dream, he said, lifting one hand and pinching his arm hard. He sighed, looking about at the windows, towards the sound of boys playing in the snow. And it makes me angry, you know? Some terrible stranger comes and takes Jack's childhood away. Never having legs to run on, arms to climb trees. That isn't what I wanted for him.
He ducked his head, looking crestfallen. He's happy, though, Sophie said softly. In fact, he's been our little light in the darkness all these years. Henry smiled a bit at that. Sophie finished oiling her knees, bending them back and forth, and then sitting back to set the oiled cloth aside. However, something stopped her, and she looked over in surprise as Henry's hand caught her own.
Here, he said quietly, taking the cloth from her hand, looking straight into the eye slots of her helmet. Those finger joints might need some care as well. Heart or no heart, something was definitely pounding in Sophie's chest.
Henry looked back down, working the oiled cloth around each finger carefully. His hands were thick and calloused, but she couldn't ever recall feeling a softer touch. Sophie! They pulled their hands away at once, and Sophie looked up as Lumiere pushed open the workshop door and slipped inside. Cogsworth followed, nearly knocking his back as the door swung shut. "Sophie!" the old clock huffed, hobbling over. "We have an urgent task for you." "Oh," she said, a little disappointed at the interruption. "What is it?" "Do you know how to waltz?" Lumiere asked eagerly. "Waltz?" she said in surprise. "Why, yes, a little bit." "Ah, Dieu merci!" he exclaimed. "If you didn't, I don't know what we would do."
"I can waltz too," Henry offered. For some reason Lumiere snickered about that. Cogsworth merely cleared his throat. "I believe we'll go for the Mademoiselle for this one," the clock said matter-of-factly.
"Come, come!" Lumiere cried, hopping back towards the door. "He's only got the evening to practice. There isn't a moment to lose." Belle wiped her brow on the back of her arm, looking about her small, empty cottage. She hadn't anticipated quite how much dust had accumulated, nor the amount of snow that had piled atop the path up to the hill. Her arms ached from the hours spent shoveling the walk, the afternoon spent on her knees mopping the floors. She sighed in satisfaction, however, feeling some of the guilt at abandoning the place dissipate with the completion of her tasks. Genevieve had seemed relieved to see her, embracing the girl in a tight hug when she showed up on their porch. Belle's heart had warmed at that, surprised that anyone had missed her at all. She had made up an excuse about staying with a distant relative, and the neighbouring family had accepted the offer to care for her home without any objection. Still, it had taken all the much longer than planned, and darkness had already blanketed the small village. She sighed, exhausted, but still intent on visiting the old bookseller once more, before heading to bed. She glanced back towards the door, Sir Giles resting against the wall, his quiet snore mingling with Max's heavy breathing from where he slept beside the fire. The swordsman needed to sleep, considering he had agreed to stand guard that night as she slept. Tiptoeing quietly past him, Belle grabbed the thick cloak Adam had given her, and slipped quietly into the cold night air. She moved quickly down the winding trail leading to the main road of the village. Most of the shops were closed this late, though several lanterns hung in the street, and sent shadows dancing across the cobblestones. "I hope he's still awake at this hour," Belle thought belatedly, rounding a corner into the village square where the bookshop was located. There a large crowd was gathered in the lamplight. Belle caught a loud voice echoing from its centre. "Wrestle the old brute with my bare hands!" Gaston proclaimed, patting a large dead animal lying in the back of a wagon. He jumped up beside it, standing tall over the crowds, flexing his arms. "As you see, I've got biceps to spare." A very unladylike word crossed Belle's mind, and she spun on her heel, throwing up her hood and bolting back the way she had come, before Gaston could catch sight of her. "Belle!" Too late, she thought, groaning. She continued moving regardless, but with a heavy thump, Gaston jumped from the wagon and caught up with her in a moment, crowds parting at his will. His rough hand grabbed her wrist, holding it in place. "Belle! I knew you couldn't resist the chance to hear tales of my glory." It took every ounce of self-control not to roll her eyes at him. "You're mistaken, Gaston. I'm only here to visit Monsieur—" "Come, everyone! Drinks on me!" he proclaimed, cutting her off and waving the crowd towards his pub across the street. They cheered as Gaston put a tight arm around Belle's shoulders, dragging her along and pounding through the swinging doors of the tavern. What seemed like half the village occupants filed in behind them, loud chatter and harsh laughs filling the room, which smelled of liquor and tobacco. Belle wrinkled her nose, pulling against Gaston's grip. He only held on tighter. "What'll it be, Belle? Brandy? Rum?" He paused, swiping a beer from a tray passing by. He took several long gulps, wiping his lip on the back of his arm before smirking. "Oh, perhaps your delicate senses can only handle the cider." "I'm not thirsty," Belle said irritably, glancing across the crowded room in search of an opening to escape. Distracted, she hadn't noticed something slip from her satchel until the object was already in Gaston's hand. She looked up, freezing in horror, as she saw the beautiful notebook held aloft in Gaston's grip as he looked at it with disgust. "Oh, another one," he chided, dangling it precariously between his fingers. "No, no, please, not that one!" Belle thought frantically, looking over at the ale-coated floor beneath their feet, the roaring fire just inches away. "Gaston, may I have my book, please?" she asked as firmly as she could manage. Ignoring her, he flipped open the covers, brows raised at the sight.
"Ah, well, at least this one has pictures,"
he said lightly, brushing a few pages across with his dirty fingers. He paused on one, narrowing his eyes at a sketch of Adam on one of its pages.
"What's—"
Belle snapped the notebook shut, yanking it from his grip and burying it quickly back into her bag. "It's nothing, Gaston. Simply some drawings of things I imagined," she lied. He barked out a laugh, ringing across the busy tavern.
"Oh, Belle, you're really something," he said, shaking his head. "Wasting your time drawing? How useless."
Those nearby laughed along with him, and Belle felt tears burning her eyes. Adam doesn't think it's useless. Gaston, of course, didn't notice the hurt in her eyes as he grabbed another mug of ale from one of the passing waitresses.
"You know, Belle," he went on, "what you should be doing is—"
"What, Gaston?" she snapped. She was so tired from the day, so tired of being back around these people who cared so little about her, that she suddenly couldn't take it anymore. "Darning your socks, cooking your dinner, bearing your miserable children," she spat, voice growing louder on every word. The people around had begun to turn towards them, though in her anger Belle did notice. "What in the world makes you think I would ever want to be with you?" she cried. "You, a man who could care less about my feelings, who threatened my family and let me starve in order to—" Belle stopped, letting out a pained gasp as sharp fingers dug into her shoulder. Gaston was staring at her with a darker look in his eyes than she had ever seen in them. Her heart fell into her stomach, eyes growing wide as she realised what she had done.
"Ha! Good one, Belle!"
he guffawed, loudly enough for everyone to hear, and his crowd of sycophants laughing openly along with him, before returning to their own recreation. Still, the anger hadn't left his eyes as he said it, nor did his eyes leave her.
"What was I thinking?" Belle thought in horror. What will he do now?"
As if to answer her thoughts, he pulled her back the way they had come and into the freezing night air, dragging her into the adjacent empty alleyway. Belle felt her whole body growing numb, trembling head to toe as she tried to think of a way she could talk herself out of this.
"If only I'd brought Sir Giles into town!"
Gaston pushed her against the tavern's outer wall, his rough hand still hard against her shoulder, thumb digging sharply into her collarbone. It took all she had not to whimper in pain.
"Belle,"
Gaston began.
He sighed. "I've tried to be patient with you. I really have."
He sounded strangely calm, but even stranger than that, he sounded level-headed. Belle only stared at him, swallowing roughly.
"Say something," she begged herself. "Do something! Anything!" "I've offered you everything you could ever ask for," he went on, "and I simply ask for one thing in return." "But I never wanted."
His hand moved to her neck, thumb pressing hard against her throat. Belle suddenly couldn't speak, much less breathe. She reached for his wrist, trying to pull him off, but he only pressed harder. "You will not speak back to me," he snarled, "and you will never, ever embarrass me like that again." Unable to do anything else, Belle only nodded, feeling her eyes water in pain, before he finally let her breathe again. She gasped for a moment, limbs quaking, wishing more than anything she could just be home. And not the home she had just come from, but the home where warm, gentle arms waited for her.
"Ah, Belle,"
Gaston went on, pulling back a little and cocking his head.
"I forget. You're still young."
He drawled as his eyes raked over her with lust, the thumb that had just been restraining her now brushing over her jaw, her lips.
"Maybe you just need a little taste of what you're missing."
Before she could even register what that might mean, Gaston's mouth had encased hers, his tongue forcing its way between her lips and into her throat, gagging, she pressed back as hard as she could against his chest, but she may as well have been trying to break through a brick wall. Adam! She thought desperately. Adam, please, help! His tongue roamed around her mouth for a long minute, hands sliding up her back and tugging painfully at her hair before he finally let her go. Belle couldn't even respond, gasping for breath again as he pulled away.
Ah, I see I've left you speechless,
Gaston said proudly, chuckling to himself. Don't cry, not now, Belle thought desperately, feeling a terrible shame wash over her.
You see? You know, Belle, there's not a girl in town who wouldn't love to be in your shoes, he said proudly. Come on. After that, there's no way you don't want to marry me now.
Belle was too terrified to even acknowledge that such an incredulous assumption. So terrified that, for once, she couldn't find the courage to flat out deny him. I don't know, she whispered weakly. He seemed satisfied enough with that.
Well, of course, you want to talk it over with your lovely parents, he said with clear distaste.
Belle only nodded, desperate for any excuse to escape. Desperate to get away before he did anything else.
Well, then, I'll be by in the morning to claim your hand, gorgeous, he said with confidence,
ruffling her hair as if she were a dog before striding back towards the tavern. Trembling head to toe, Belle waited until he was out of sight before sprinting home as fast as she could, all the while fighting the urge to be sick.
Belle!
Throwing the door open, Belle grabbed Sir Giles by the hilt and called to Max to follow her into the cold. She locked the doors with trembling fingers, racing towards the small stable and throwing the saddle over Olive's back.
Dear God, what happened?
Giles asked in concern. Belle barely managed to get the saddle hitched, knees quaking as she forced herself up onto the horse. Sir Giles, I know it's late. I know I promised Adam not to travel in the woods at night, but... She stopped, gasping and fighting back the tears now threatening to spill out. Promise or no promise, I can't stay here another minute. My lord, I think you've got it.
Really?
Adam asked. Well, you haven't stepped on my toes for the last 3 dances, so I'd call that a success. Sophie chuckled. He grimaced, scratching the back of his neck. It was probably a good thing he had opted to practice. It was certainly different trying to dance on large clawed toes, and fortunately Sophie's metal feet had allowed him to make a few mistakes before he got the hang of it.
I owe you one, he admitted, then hummed. Actually, 2.
He realised, recalling her trip to town for him. Sophie only laughed. Tell you what, you break that spell, and we'll call it even.
Adam grinned. Deal.
In fact, he planned to do just that tomorrow night. Lumiere was right. After dinner and dancing, he had the end of the night planned such as to create the perfect moment to tell her the truth. His heart raced at the thought. But what had been only nerves up until now was giving way to excitement.
May I have the next dance, mademoiselle?
Adam turned around, watching Henry bowing deeply before Sophie. Me too! Chip cried, poking out of his father's vest pocket. Sophie giggled a little, letting Henry lift her metal hand into his own. His hand rested against her armoured side as they began sweeping across the large ballroom. The fiddling coat rag who had accompanied them before picked up his instrument once again at the sight, Chip laughing from between them.
There's a lot at stake here,
Adam realised. He had been so distracted by his growing relationship with Belle lately that he had nearly forgotten all that would truly change once the spell was broken. Thoughts turned to her again. He moved into the hall, picking up the enchanted mirror he'd left on a corner table. He had already checked on Belle about a dozen times since she had left, having relaxed a bit once she had made it safely to town. Still, he couldn't help but check once more before heading to bed.
Show me Belle's safe,
he ordered. He waited, expecting to see her warm cottage with a light in the window, to convince him of her safe return.
But nothing happened. Show me Belle's safe,
he repeated, slowly, growing nervous. Again the mirror didn't respond.
Show me Belle!
He cried, grabbing the delicate handle with both paws. It responded at last. It showed Belle, atop Olive, racing through the dark woods. What was she doing? She shouldn't be riding back yet. It was well past sunset already. She didn't seem to be in danger. But if she was safe, what... Wouldn't the mirror have responded to his first question? What threatens her? He demanded, already racing towards the palace entrance. The mirror glowed once again, and Adam's heart flew into his throat. Sharp growls echoed from the reflection, a pack of wolves staring right back at him. Hurry! Hurry, Olive! The horse galloped harder through the forbidden woods, but the snow lining the path of the castle grounds slowed even the strong animal's progress. Belle didn't dare stray from the road, however, even with the howling creatures closing in on them. No, attempting to navigate the thick trees was certainly a death trap. Belle gripped the reins harder, knuckles numb from shock and fear. Gaston and Molly knew. The wolves here was nowhere safe. Adam was right, she thought in panicked regret. I never should have left. Pull me free, Giles said quickly, the growls of the wolves closing by the minute. Belle obeyed, sliding the blade from the scabbard at her hip. Keep a firm grip, but relax your arm if you can, he went on, surprisingly calm. I will guide it myself. Belle did as he said, at least as best she could. She felt the sword shift in her grip, raising her arm on her own. Giles hoisted himself aloft to her side. Soft padding against the earth alerted her to the pack, now nearly upon them. Max was barking madly at them, snapping his teeth at any animal that edged too close to the trail. Guide Olive on, Gaston continued levelly. I can cut the wolves down as we ride. Belle nodded, snapping the reins with her free hand and trying impossibly to keep calm. The wolves gaining more courage the further they rode, and were soon surrounding them on each side. In an instant, her arm pulled down sharply, Giles slicing through the flesh of one beast as it came too close, blood splattering across her skirt and Olive's bright white coat. Belle gasped, but grit her teeth quickly and forced herself to remain focused on the path ahead. She caught something in the corner of her eye, sharp claw marks against the trees. Adam's markers! The edge of the palace grounds. Her arm was forced across her body, slashing at a wolf on the other side. The attack missed, but the animal pulled back all the same. Suddenly, the sound of more heavy paws against the ground rang out from across the dark trees just ahead of them. Olive slowed, neighing in alarm and backing away. The wolves behind took the opportunity to surround them. But a moment later, something enormous emerged from the shadows and sent the creatures scattering. Adam landed on the path, rising to his full height, a powerful presence in the dim moonlight. He turned back to Belle, stepping over quickly and pulling her close in one arm. His free arm swept gently over Olive's coat, the strokes of her master calming the frightened animal in an instant.
Cover your ears, he whispered, and don't be afraid.
He released Belle as the wolves started to circle them once more. Belle raised her hands to her ears, the growls replaced by a loud pumping of her own pulse inside of her head. A terrifying roar flooded the air. Oh, the warlike cry of a dozen creatures at once. It seemed to shake the very forest itself. And that was what dampened as it was beneath her fingers. Belle couldn't imagine how loud it would be if she had not been covering her ears. Belle looked behind her after the initial shock, watching as Adam finished his cry, the wolves scampering several paces away in fear. He bared his teeth, dropping to his paws and bolting towards them. The animals scattered further, and Adam stood tall once again, sucking in a deep breath and roaring a second time. The pack sprinted off at that, disappearing into the darkness. Shoulders sagging, Adam turned back slowly. It was impossible to read his expression, not amidst the darkness, not the way her heart was still ramming itself against her chest. He was beside her again in a heartbeat.
Can you still ride?
Belle blinked at him. Aye, she breathed, feeling Giles' bloody hint in one hand, watching as the forest began to spin around her. She swallowed, forcing her vision back into focus. I can. He grabbed the reins as she must have dropped them in her shock, placing them back in her hands.
Ride swiftly, and hold to the road. I'll stay behind you.
Belle nodded, too filled with emotion to wonder how he would be able to keep up with them. She simply gave Olive a kick, less desperate than before, leaning low as they took off towards home. Heavy thumping followed them, and Adam was soon beside her, sprinting on all fours. He could run as fast as a horse. The rest of the journey was eventless. the towering gates of the castle never looking more welcome to Belle as she sped through them. Adam pushed himself to his feet as they approached, slowing to an upright run and letting Max through the entrance before turning and locking the metal gates into place. Belle forced her stiff fingers apart, releasing the reins and sliding awkwardly off of the horse onto shaking feet. Adam steadied her in a moment later, breathing heavily. The freezing air clouded around their faces as they moved through the snow to the palace steps. Inside, the grand hall was quiet, lit by a few distant candles, but the air still cool, but significantly warmer than outside.
"Why are you back?"
Adam asked sharply. It wasn't directed at her, however, but at Sir Giles.
"My lord."
Giles had managed up the steps to the palace on his own, blade still coated in the wolf's blood. Belle realised they must have left him slip from her fingers earlier.
"My apologies,
He tried to convince me to wait till the dawn," Belle said quietly. Her teeth were chattering, either from the cold or lingering fear, she didn't know. "But I was too afraid he'd come back, that he'd realise I'd lied to him."
"Oh."
"That he'd do something worse."
"What?" Adam asked anxiously. "Worse than what?"
Belle felt a lump growing in her throat, fighting back tears. "Oh, Adam! I'm so sorry. You were right. I never should have left," she cried, shaking her head at her own foolishness.
"Good God, Belle! What happened?"
he asked in fear, paws encasing her shoulders. She winced, a soft gasp of pain escaping her lips, even with his gentle touch. He pulled back quickly, eyes growing wide. A moment later, he reached out again, untying her cloak and letting it fall away.
"Oh my God," he breathed.
Belle looked up, catching her own reflection in the mirror behind him. A bruise sat at the base of her throat, curling around one side and disappearing beneath the neckline of her dress.
"Who's done this to you?"
Adam cried. Belle only shook her head. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, letting her face fall into her hands.
"It was that man, my lord," Giles offered. "The one from the village."
Adam didn't even ask who Giles meant. He must have known.
"Oh no," he gasped. "Did he?" "From what I could get out of her, it's not what you're thinking, my prince."
Belle felt Adam's hand reach for her own a moment later, his opposite arm wrapping around her waist, but just barely brushing, as if she would shatter at his touch.
"Call for Dr. Mathias,"
he rasped, turning back towards the silent guards.
"Immediately! Yes, your highness."
Belle felt herself being guided down the dark halls, entering the large main sitting room where the fire was already lit. The doctor arrived a moment later, along with Mrs. Potts atop Anne's tray. Belle was grateful to see her, accepting a cup of chamomile tea and shaking hands. Adam sat beside her, looking more frantic than she'd ever seen him. Mathias looked at her injury, then turned to Adam.
"My lord, there are some empty ice bags in my office drawers. We'll need a couple of those filled with fresh snow. If you could."
Adam was already on his feet, nodding earnestly and sprinting from the room.
"My dear, are you all right letting me see the rest of those bruises?"
Belle pursed her lips and nodded, undoing a couple of buttons on her dress and pulling the sleeve off of her shoulder. She glanced down, distinct, finger-shaped spots rising from her collarbone and shoulder. Belle could suddenly taste the remnants of beer on her tongue, feel Gaston's rough, cruel fingers holding her in place. A couple of tears dripped down her cheeks as she brushed them away quickly. The door opened again, and Adam ran in with an armful of cloth ice bags. He nearly dropped them when he saw her, looking heartbroken. Belle stared quickly into her lap.
"Thank you, my prince," the doctor went on. "Perhaps you can send for Sophie to help us."
Adam bit his lip but nodded, and ducked his head as he started to move out of the room. "It's all right, Doctor," Belle said quickly. "He can stay." Even in her embarrassment and shame, she suddenly didn't want Adam out of her sight. He was beside her before Mathias could object, two of the cold cloth bags in one paw that he rested atop her exposed shoulder, while his other arm wrapped carefully around her. She shut her eyes, trying to forget what a fool she had been to let this happen. She couldn't forget just yet, however.
Mademoiselle,
Matthias went on carefully.
if he did anything else to you, I must know. If you'd rather us leave so you can speak with Mrs. Potts alone.
It's all right, she said quickly, biting her lip. He just pulled my hair and held me in place while he... She swallowed, throat swelling as new tears threatened to spill over. While he kissed me. She couldn't even look at Adam as she said it, letting her face fall into her hands once again. He pulled her closer against him, even as his own arms trembled.
The bastard! I'll kill him,
he growled. I know it could have been so much worse, she went on, voice muffled between her fingers. But that's what was so awful. I didn't know what he was going to do. I couldn't do anything about it. I've never been more frightened in my whole life. I'd rather face the wolves again than him, she cried.
Oh, you brave girl,
Mrs. Potts said softly, pouring her a new cup of tea. Belle took it, anything to wash out that horrible taste in her mouth. Brave, she said, shaking her head. I'm a coward. I couldn't even say anything. I could barely move. I couldn't even turn him down when he asked me to marry him, she choked out.
You were under duress,
Adam insisted. But I provoked him, she admitted. Called him out on everything he's done, in front of all his friends. If I'd only held my tongue, he wouldn't have been so angry.
I don't care what you said to him, he said fiercely. He had no right to do this to you. You did nothing wrong, Belle. Do you understand?
Trying to calm her shaky breath, Belle finally looked up at him. And nothing you agreed upon counts in such a situation, Mrs. Potts added. You said what you needed to in order to escape. And we are so very grateful that you did, love. Adam nodded, earnestly. A bit of her shame melted away at that, and Belle relaxed. Adam wasn't upset. He didn't blame her. Wasn't disgusted by her. Why had she ever thought that he would be? He's going to find out I'm gone, she realised a moment later. He's going to realise I lied to him about caring for Mammal. He said he was going to claim my hand in the morning. That's why I ran. But what if he comes looking for me? She said in fresh fear.
Let him come, Adam snarled. I'll break his bones and then throw him at the tower until he rots.
Belle sniffled, almost letting herself smile as she looked back up at him. Adam.
I'm serious, he said darkly.
Belle knew she wouldn't let him talk like that. But she just felt so safe in his arms, so relieved that he wasn't ashamed of her, that she decided to let her slide. Suddenly, the fact that she was here, that she was home, washed over her like a warm wave. She never should have left. You were right, she said quietly, leaning into him. I should have listened to you. I never should have gone back.
I was worried about the enchantress, not this, he said. You should be able to walk through your own village without being attacked, he snarled, looking towards the dark window. Damn it, if I were in charge, men like him would be.
There's no use thinking on that now, Mrs. Potts chided. Let the girls finish getting Belle into a warm bath and fresh linens. I'll bring up some supper, dear. You must be quite famished after such a hard ride. Belle nodded, feeling like she might cry again. But not from fear or shame this time, but from relief.
Continue to ice those areas for the next day, mademoiselle,
Matthias directed.
The injuries are high up enough that we shouldn't worry about organ damage, though they will take some time to heal. A week, I'd put it, considering you're young. We'll take another look tomorrow and see if we don't need to send Henry down for some comfrey and wine to aid the healing process.
He paused.
Have you had any pain in your throat?
Belle swallowed. It did hurt a bit, now that she thought about it. A little, she admitted.
Well, let's try to keep the speaking to a minimum when you can, he directed.
She pursed her lips and nodded again. As the doctor left, Belle looked back over at Adam, frowning. "What about tomorrow?" she breathed, trying not to use her voice too much.
"Don't worry about that,"
Adam said.
"You should rest for the next few days. We can do it later."
Belle nodded. She wasn't hurt that badly, but she felt absolutely shaken to the core. And the thought of dressing up for a special dinner with those ugly bruises along her neck just made her feel worse. "Sorry," she whispered again, letting him help her to her feet.
"No more apologies,"
Adam said seriously.
"The only ones who are going to be apologising to me is Gaston when I string him up by his ankles over the west balcony."
"Oh, that poor girl!" Anne exclaimed. "That man sounds like a monster!" "Most certainly," Mrs. Potts agreed, riding atop the woman's cart as they made their way back from the kitchens with a steaming tray of supper for Belle. As they rounded the corner of the main hall, she caught sight of their prince at the doors, securing a deep red cloak around his shoulders, a long ornate blade hanging from his belt. "Prince Adam?" she asked in shock. "It's past midnight. Where on earth are you going?"
"To kill a man,"
he growled. "I'm helping," Sir Giles added from his hip. Mrs. Potts raised a painted brow. "Aren't you forgetting something, dear?" The prince paused in confusion, looking back down the corridor.
"I don't think—"
He stopped suddenly, frowning.
"Mrs. Potts, don't try to stop me,"
he said decidedly, pushing open the heavy door and stepping into the cold night air. Mrs. Potts sighed. It was but a minute later that she caught several very unprincely-like words echoing from the courtyard before Adam's heavy steps stomped back up from the stairs and looking into the hall. "Remembered you can't leave, love?" she asked, trying to hide the mirth in her voice.
"Yes," he grumbled, looking away. We weren't really going to kill him,"
he muttered.
"Speak for yourself," Giles huffed. "Maybe just tear his arms off so he can never touch Belle again,"
Adam said darkly. "Oh, heavens, I don't want to hear it!" Mrs. Potts exclaimed. The prince only frowned, looking towards the west wing, his expression growing sombre.
"Belle's so strong and brave,"
he said, almost to himself.
"And that man made her feel weak and afraid. Ashamed, even."
He stopped, looking crestfallen.
"She should never have to feel that way."
They were quiet for a long moment, the nighttime winds rattling the doors behind them.
"Mrs. Potts,"
Adam asked a moment later,
"why did God make men stronger than women?"
She blinked, surprised by the question. In truth, it was one she had asked herself in the past.
"Brute strength, I mean,"
he clarified.
"It's just, I always thought we were meant to use it to protect. But it seems more of us use it to hurt, to abuse. Gaston, my uncle, his men."
He stopped, staring absently at the floor.
"If that's what's going to happen, I'd rather not be strong at all."
Mrs. Potts's expression softened. "I don't know the answer, dear," she admitted, "but I do believe those who misuse their power will get their due ends, whether in this life or the next." Adam's frown deepened.
"I'd prefer they get it sooner rather than later."
Mrs. Potts sighed, wishing she could hug the boy. She had certainly grown quite fond of him all these years. "How about you bring Belle her supper?" she suggested. "She should be settled in her room by now. I'm sure she'd appreciate your company." Adam looked back at her, as if coming to himself, and nodded. He released Giles from his hip, tugging off his cloak and dropping it to the floor, before grabbing the tray and heading quickly towards the west wing.
"Well, I have to say," Giles said once Adam was out of sight, "I certainly never thought so deeply about such things at his age."
Mrs. Potts chuckled. "I dare say a few of us did."
"His father was truly a great ruler," Giles went on. "The best I've known. But I must admit, I do believe our prince would have been even greater."
"With any luck, he'll still have that chance," Mrs. Potts smiled.
I certainly hope so.
The tavern doors flew open, an enormous presence filling the threshold. "You're all invited to my wedding!" Gaston boomed over the chatter of drunken voices. "Another round on me!" A chorus of cheers greeted him, and he stomped into the room, his loyal toadies surrounding him, slapping his solid shoulders and passing him several drinks. A few girls broke into sobs, though the triplets were noticeably absent. "Who's the lucky girl, Gaston?" a squat man asked. Gaston gulped down an entire mug of ale, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and grinned. "Belle, of course. We'll be married tomorrow," he declared proudly. The room fell quiet at that, a few murmurs replacing the cheers from before. Gaston frowned. They should be congratulating him all the more. What was wrong with these people? "Gaston," someone asked, "won't you be waiting for the Duponts to return before holding the ceremony?"
"Return?"
he asked in confusion. They're still in Paris, aren't they?" the short man from before asked, scratching his head nervously.
"We thought you would have known. They've been gone for months."
Gaston blinked, embarrassment flooding over him for the second time that night. It was all he could do to not throw the mug in his hand to the ground in anger. Instead, he sucked in a breath, forcing a grin across his face.
"Ha! Of course I know," he declared. "Belle's my girl. Why wouldn't I know that?"
People around started to relax, nodding in encouragement.
I was only kidding about tomorrow. I'm just so excited I forgot myself,"
he lied, feigning sheepishness. The crowd around laughed heartily, cheering once again and offering him the congratulations he deserved. Even so, Gaston found little enjoyment in the celebration, the liquor sour on his tongue as he slowly processed this new information. An hour later, it finally clicked. If Madame Dupont was in Paris, then that meant Belle and her father had found the money to get her there, which meant someone had given it to them. He was supposed to do that. Once Belle agreed to marry him, of course. No wonder she continued to refuse him. And not only that, but they'd been gone for months without his knowledge. Gaston, of course, didn't acknowledge his own fault in this, instead assuming Belle would always be right where he wanted her. Yet, by simply inquiring after her, or paying attention to anything besides the words from his own mouth, he could have easily heard the news weeks ago. But no, Gaston was never at fault. This was Belle's doing. She had kept the truth from him. She'd lied to him. No one lied to Gaston. He growled, standing from the counter and pushing his way through the crowds. They were so intoxicated by now, few noticed him leave.
"Who does she think she is?"
he thought, fuming as he stormed through the snowy streets.
"That girl is tangled with the wrong man."
It didn't take him long to reach the hill to her tiny house. He stomped up the freshly shoveled path, up the stone steps to her porch. He raised a fist and pounded 3 times.
"Belle!"
he shouted.
"Let me in!"
Silence. He grit his teeth, pounding a dozen more times before pulling back and folded his arms.
"I know you're there. Open up!"
Nothing. Trembling in anger, he stepped back, lifting his foot and kicking the handle with all his might. It creaked, but held. He wrinkled his nose and repeated the process twice more before the heavy door finally flew open. Moonlight spilled across the empty floors, a few dying embers glowing in the hearth. Something had fallen to the floor at his feet. A strange contraption. Probably one of Maurice's old, ridiculous inventions. Gaston stepped at it as he crossed the threshold, the device cracking beneath the weight of his boot. He looked around the empty space and frowned, confused. Where was their furniture? Their belongings? Surely Belle wasn't that poor. How pathetic, he thought. Why in the world wouldn't she accept him? She'd be the richest woman in town. Belle, he demanded, sweeping through the home, checking the small bedroom, climbing the ladder to the loft. But the house was not only completely bare, but completely unoccupied. Damn wench, he growled, stomping back out the door. not even bothering to shut it behind him. He scowled, plopping down on the floor of the front porch and resting his large chin in his hands. He thought back over the night, recalling that book full of drawings. Drawings of trees and teacups and a hideous beast. His eyes grew wide. He'd seen that creature before, hadn't he? "It was a beast, father!" Gaston cried. "A horrible, monstrous beast!" Monsieur Legume only laughed at his son. "There's no such thing." "But I saw it," the young man insisted. "I swear, he was enormous. I'd say at least 8, no more, like 10 feet. His father huffed. "And I suppose you also weren't drinking before this excursion of yours?" Gaston growled. If only he had managed to kill that monster. He would have proved it. Suddenly he had an idea. "We can go together," he suggested. "Take a crew of men to the northern woods and lay a trap for the beast can't possibly escape." "The northern woods?" his father asked, growing angry. "Those woods are forbidden. Don't you dare tell me you went there." "It doesn't matter, father," Gaston huffed, crossing his arms and leaning back in his seat. "No one guards the place anymore. And if I could just catch that beast, I'd be known as the greatest hunter in—" "Don't be a fool," his father said, cutting him off. "The king's orders are not to be ignored. He's only just appointed our family nobles, de Cloche. I will not have you going off and ruining our new position for some reckless hunting trophy. But enough. If I hear of you venturing out there again, you can say goodbye to your monthly allowance." That had been enough to dissuade him. Gaston was not one to live the life of a beggar. So he had forgotten the creature, focusing on ridding the surrounding woods of lesser beasts. Now, though, he could no longer ignore the creature's existence. Had Belle encountered the beast as well? He huffed, frowning in confusion. It made no sense. The thought of her distracted him again, however. The way she had looked in the dark alley. Eyes wide, full of fear. Not unlike a rabbit caught in one of his snares. He smirked in spite of himself. She might have escaped him again and again, but he'd managed to trap her then. And that look on her face made it all worth it. A look of submission, of powerlessness, the way a woman should look in his arms. He licked his lips. Who cared if she was more trouble than she was worth? The victory would more than make up for it. "I'll have Belle for my wife," he thought darkly. "Make no mistake about that." "Oh my," someone said. "You will do quite nicely, won't you?" Gaston stopped, cocking his head and looking towards the sound of the voice. A woman emerged from the shadows, pulling back her hood. Long white gold hair fell free, trailing to her waist, bright red eyes looking down at him. "Who are you?" Gaston asked, standing quickly. "Just a humble traveller," she said deeply. She came closer, and Gaston caught sight of her figure in the moonlight. He hummed in pleasure. Perhaps such a woman was just what he needed to distract himself tonight. "Yes, quite nicely," she said, seeming to size him up, before pulling something from behind her. A rose. Gaston felt his eyes grow drowsy. The enchantress watched the man's eyes droop beneath her spell, his pupils growing large. She grinned, looking him over. He was enormous. Probably the largest man she'd ever laid eyes on. And soon he would be hers. She led him into the house behind them. The inside was empty. Perfect. No witnesses to take care of, the witch thought. She didn't like it when things got messy. "You are the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen," he said from behind her. Yes, I know." She stopped, frowning when she looked back at him. The man was staring into a dim mirror against the wall, unabashedly admiring himself. She raised a brow. Strange. She'd never seen the rose's spell work in such a way before. Rolling her eyes, she snapped her fingers at him. He looked back, the lust in his eyes refocusing on herself, as it should. She sighed, tugging him close, pulling him down towards the kiss that would convert all of that brute strength into a store of magic she could use for herself.
"Gee," he said, just before their lips met, "you're pretty. Almost as pretty as my girl Belle."
Eyes growing wide, the enchantress pulled away. "What did you say?" she asked, irritable but equally curious. Could this man be speaking of that Belle?
"Belle's the most beautiful girl in the village,"
the man declared, in an almost drunken tone. He raised a finger, like a scholar explaining a complicated theory to his students.
"That makes her the best."
Frowning deeper, the witch let the rose close up in an instant. The man blinked for a long moment before his pupils constricted back to their normal size.
You're still here,"
he drawled, looking over her with hungry eyes. Frankly, he didn't act too much different with or without the spell, it seemed. "Yes," she said impatiently, turning towards the mirror the man had been admiring himself in before. She pressed her finger to its surface, letting the reflection dissolve into an image of the one woman she couldn't wait to be rid of. The girl sat in a grand bed, holding something against her shoulder and running her fingers through the large mutt's fur who sat nestled at her side.
"Hey,"
the man said, furrowing his large brows and pulling the mirror off the wall with both hands. He looked behind it, found nothing, then stared back at its surface.
"What's Belle doing in here?"
he asked in confusion, shaking the mirror violently, as though the action would dump the girl back on the floor. The enchantress rolled her eyes again. "She's not inside it, you imbecile." He stopped, frowning deeply and looking back at her.
"I don't know what that means."
"It means idiot, idiot."
"Hey!" he barked,
making a fist and towering above her.
"Nobody calls Gaston an— Ow!"
he cried as she snatched his wrist in her fingers. She grew several feet in a matter of seconds. The man's eyes grew to the size of saucers. He dropped the mirror in surprise, and it shattered again across the bare floors. The witch frowned, squeezing with the strength of 10 men. She made it 11, and he whimpered in her hold, falling to his knees. "Listen, you pathetic man!" she spat, casting a hand towards the mirror, and letting her magic restore the broken pieces. "You want that girl back, don't you?" He looked back as the image of Belle resurfaced. He nodded, eyes filling with tears at the pain. She loosened her grip a bit, leaning down and brushing the sharp nails of her opposite hand across the man's thick jaw. He was attractive, yes, but nowhere near as handsome as her beast would be once he was hers. "Then listen to me," she said, letting her voice grow soft. "She's been placed under a powerful spell, one by a great beast of the forest. He keeps her coming back to his castle, hidden deep in the northern woods," she explained, weaving the lie as she pointed towards the mirror once again. The beast was there now, sitting on the edge of the bed and brushing the woman's hair from her face. She reached for his paw. Gaston watched with increasing fury, nose wrinkling in disgust.
"It's him!" he snarled, eyes blazing. "That monster!"
"Oh?" the witch asked with intrigue. "You've met this beast?"
"I knew it!" Gaston fumed. "I knew I didn't imagine the creature. He's taken my Belle. No wonder she won't have me."
"Exactly," the enchantress said, feeding the man's rage. "Now, you do exactly as I say, and you'll have her back." The man raised his brows, but listened intently as she gave him his simple instructions. He wasn't bright enough for much else, it seemed. "You understand?" she asked at least. The man narrowed his eyes for a moment, then grinned.
"Yeah, I get it."
The witch nodded, moving towards the door. At the threshold, she paused, however, turning back to him. "Just remember," she added, pulling on her hood, "the beast is mine." Belle opened her eyes. It was still night, the wind having picked up in the last past hours, rattling the bedroom's large windows. She shivered. The cloth bags filled with snow had since melted, but bits of water now clung to her skin where they had rested. leaving her chilled to the bone. She pulled them off, setting them aside and sitting up further against the pillows propped around her. She smiled a bit, recalling Adam bringing 6 of them in and tucking them in around her himself.
Matthews told me you should alleviate the injury,
he insisted, and while he'd been more than attentive, she still noticed an absent look about him, his eyes narrowing as he gazed towards the covered windows. She knew Adam was thinking about Gaston in those moments, his blue eyes growing darker than she'd ever seen them.
Thought you could run away from me, did you?
Belle froze, every muscle in her body growing stiff as the voice echoed in the room.
Gaston's voice. But that wasn't possible. Couldn't be possible.
Belle remained still, unblinking, unbreathing, hoping it was only a terrible figment of her imagination. A dark figure emerged from the curtains and stood at the side of her bed. She tried to scream, but her voice was too hoarse to make a sound. Gaston's monstrous form threw back the blankets, kneeling over her, holding her against the mattress by her wrists. She mustered every ounce of strength to fight against him, but he only held on tighter. His cruel smile shone through the darkness, coming closer and closer until... A faint cry rang in her ears. Her own cry. Belle blinked. Gaston was gone. She was safely tucked into the sheets, the wet snowpacks still sitting against her shoulder, as though she had never pulled them away. A nightmare, she realised, trembling head to toe. She looked around the room, the shadowed curtains looking much like a man standing in the shadows and watching her. She knew it couldn't be, but found herself frozen in fear again, just like in her dream. She wished she could light the candles, but even moving away from the safety of the bed seemed like an impossible task. She flinched as something scratched against the floor, but soon realised it was only Max coming over in response to her cry. She let him onto the bed, burying her face in his fur. Frowning, she sucked in a breath. Why was she letting Gaston hold so much power over her? With a burst of courage, she managed to light the candle beside the bed with trembling fingers. Crawling to the end of the mattress, she held it out, letting the soft glow fall over the room. No feet stuck out from behind the curtains. No strange shapes poked out from the corners or from behind the rich furnishings. She sighed, though the fear lingered in her chest. She looked towards the bookshelf across the room, thinking about the man on the other side of its hidden passage. She shook her head. So foolish. How could she think to bother Adam about something like this, and in the middle of the night? Still, the idea only grew in her mind after she lay back down, and she finally huffed, grabbing the candle once again and putting on a robe as she moved quickly across the dark room. She reached the bookshelf, sucked in a breath, and pulled the trick lever. She could have just gone into the hall and knocked on his door, but she was suddenly embarrassed at what the guards down the hall would think of her. This seemed safer, somehow. She heard the lock click and the shelves loosen in place. Sliding them aside, she reached for the door, which she opted to leave unlocked, pulling it open and stepping into the dark passage. She was at the other side in a moment, hand hesitating over the handle. She bit her lip, wondering if this was such a good idea after all. Before she could change her mind, she heard something slide away on the other side, and the door was quickly pulled open by its owner.
Bull,
Adam breathed, looking down at her. She blinked, staring up at his form framed by the firelight behind him. Adam! How did you know I was here?
I heard you opening the other side, he explained. Are you all right?
She nodded. I had a dream, she admitted, voice more hoarse than she'd really expected it to be. Well, a nightmare, really. She sighed, embarrassed, suddenly feeling extremely childish. I'm sorry for waking you.
I'm a light sleeper,
he said, shaking his head. His hand found hers in the darkness.
Do you want to talk about it?
He stopped, grimacing.
Oh, but your voice.
She thought back to the dream and shuddered. "I'd rather not anyway," she whispered. She frowned, biting her lip. Why had she come then? They were quiet for a long moment. Adam started, looking around her towards her room.
"Would you like me to?"
"Yes," she said quickly, moving aside so he could follow her back. He did, keeping a hand on around her shoulders as he held the opposite door open for her. Oh, but he was gentle. It seemed even more obvious now after the incident with Gaston. Guiding her back to the bed, he then turned and swept through the room, checking each hidden shadow. Belle wasn't sure if he was truly worried about intruders, or if he only sensed it would help her feel better, but she relaxed all the same.
"I'll be right back," he promised a moment later,
picking up the cloth sacks of melted snow, and moved back through the passageway to his room. Not a moment later he returned, shutting the small door behind him. He paused for a long moment, then pulled the bookcase closed as well, before moving back beside her. The bags were cold again. He must have refilled them with snow from his balcony. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Adam reached towards the neckline of her chemise. He paused, eyes meeting hers in a silent request for permission. She nodded, loosening her robe and feeling gentle fingers brush against her sleeve, the cold cloth against her skin a second later. Though it felt good against the bruises themselves, it left the rest of her freezing. She shivered. Adam shirked off his own robe and moved closer, wrapping his opposite arm around her and pulling her against him. The small patch of cold between them now fought against his great warmth. Belle closed her eyes. "Don't go," she breathed, pulling her hands to his soft chest and resting her head against him. To her surprise, he didn't hesitate.
"I won't."
He looked down, met her eyes, and then reached back for her comforter. Belle lied down as he pulled it over them, curling up against him as he settled down himself. She felt his knees tuck up beneath her, his paws still holding the snow-cold cloth against her skin, as his other arm draped over her side. He reached up, thumb brushing her cheek and tucking a strand of hair behind her ear before cradling the back of her head. Belle closed her eyes once again. Adam whispered something in the darkness, but she was too far gone to hear it. Her sleep was deep, and she dreamed only of a man with light auburn hair holding her close. But she wasn't afraid. Somehow, she knew exactly who he was. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that. Oh my god, that was a nightmare chapter to read. I hope I didn't make it too scary for any of you. And please, before I start on what I like about this chapter, please know if this has happened to you, this worse or not as bad, know that it is never your fault. If you are powerless in a situation, then it has nothing to do with your fault. You hear me? There are people who will help you. There are people you can go to. Please, my lovely listeners, do not think yourselves weak for this, okay? If it ever happens to you, know that you have friends, even if you've never met them. And if you would like, I would like to be your friend as well. I already feel like you're mine from watching my videos. Anyway, moving on to the things I like about this. I love that Adam says, like I said, that it's not your fault. I love how all of them are so protective of her. And I don't agree with couples having fights, but I do agree that people will disagree. It's a healthy lesson to learn that you're not always going to agree with someone, no matter how much you love them, because we all have different viewpoints and experiences. I think that's a healthy lesson to learn. And I love that bit at the very, very end, when Belle and Adam are all curled up, and Belle dreams of him in his human form, knowing who he is deep down. I love that. She's seeing the man behind the beast in a different way than what she already was. Anyway, again, I'm sorry if I've made this too dark for any of you. Just know that I've got your back, okay? And that there are people you can go to. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Take care, my guys, girls, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!